Well, good evening to you. It's a real pleasure for me to be in Houston. The rest of the world heard something about your baseball team recently. The stories were true. The thing about the titanium jaw, I tried to take out a Jeep with my bicycle commuting to work, and that always ends poorly for the guy on the bike. So faith in science, that's the takeaway. Don't do the whole bicycle Jeep thing. No, it really is fun for me to be here with you this evening. And the main reason for this is that I know that this is a community that wrestles with ideas, that thinks scientifically. And for a number of years now, I've had forums and different interactions on thinking about the relationship between faith and science. And the reason that I'm interested in speaking to you tonight is because I grew up without these two things being in conflict. So sort of an insider, I had to learn the conflict model that these might be in tension. And so growing up that way, I kind of came to an understanding of why is it that people hold these in tension? And so I want to speak as a little bit of an insider that helps translate between different voices in our culture to help us facilitate good conversation and good discussions as we go forward. Now, for the whole physics and philosophy undergrad thing, when I showed up for my oral honors examinations, they said, "What did you learn?" And I said, "Well, now I can calculate the velocity of a philosopher when he falls out of an ivory tower." One of the fields answers a little bit more of the why questions, and then physics gives us a little bit more of the how and the process of how things are put together. And then I spent 3 years in Boston speaking kind of from Dartmouth to Brown, mainly at Harvard and MIT, and a lot of times on these topics and wrestling with young people who are trying to think through how they want to view the world. And so 4 things just quickly as we kind of set the stage or outline the boundaries of where we want to go that I've found to be helpful as we think through this conversation are to hold these 4 things in the back of our minds. And the first one is that unfortunately only mathematical proofs are provable. When we talk about wanting absolute proof for something, you guys are all masters of geometric proofs or you wouldn't be sitting in this room tonight. But only those things are provable. And unfortunately, the mathematically provable things in this world aren't the places where we find the deepest meaning and fulfillment. For example, if I work differential equations, my wife doesn't look at me all googly-eyed, like that's really a romantic thing to do. So the love itself is not mathematically provable, but math is mathematically provable. And so we want to be careful how we use the word proof, just in general. It's worth thinking about what we mean by that. The second thing is that there are people who are really good philosophers that are lousy theologians and even lousier scientists. And there are people that are good theologians and lousy scientists. And there are people that are great scientists and lousy philosophers. And just because you're good in philosophy or theology or science doesn't necessarily mean that you're epic and awesome in everything. Several years ago, CNN ran a 50 most famous atheists in the world, and it was they were all singers and songwriters. And I thought, well, your dashing good looks and melodious voice clearly make you the master of all reality. And so we want to recognize that where we gain our prominence or our credibility from doesn't necessarily translate into other categories. And this will be an important thing I think you'll see that will pop up as you guys start coming back with questions about who has the right to say what in which categories. The third thing is that there are limits to the knowledge of what we can know in any given field now. Ira Flatow, who is the longtime host of NPR's Science Friday, wrote a book called Present at the Future. And in that book, he talks about how irritated people would be when he would make allusions to things and say, well, you know what, there's scientific evidence that points to these things, but scientists haven't quite agreed how to interpret all of this. And science by nature is continuously changing and pushing the boundary and seeking to discover more and push into things. And so it's not that if we put faith and science in separate categories, that everything is nailed down as in airtight arguments in either of those fields. I grew up beside the world's largest fully steerable telescope in Green Bank, West Virginia. All of my friends' parents had double PhDs in astrophysics and cosmology and all kinds of fun stuff, and it was a wonderful place to grow up. And in the background of my peripheral vision, we had this 485-foot tall telescope with a 2.3-acre dish that had this blinking light on top of it, and it was almost continuously kind of reminding us, there's more out there, there's more out there, there's more out there. Keep looking, keep pushing, keep exploring, and delight in doing so. And so my childhood was formed by this idea that there are always new limits. We're always pushing the boundary. We're always looking to something. We're looking for somebody who can mathematically model light better, or whatever your field is in engineering or molecular biology, you name it. So there's the unknown, and that's beautiful, and it's something we're excited about. And the fourth and final thing, just to set the parameters, is to be realistic about the way that we actually engage evidence. People often say, I would believe this or if there was more evidence. And just to I don't know. I've had great conversations about the evils of processed sugar while eating glazed donuts. So there are things that we intellectually know are true, but we still don't make life decisions based off of that. And so to wrestle with the fullness of what it means to be human is to recognize that our rationality is part of the foundation of how we make a decision, but not necessarily the totality of it. Okay, so if we can kind of keep those four in the back of our minds, I think that'll help us sort out some things later with your questions. But the biggest distinction that we need to make that I think is the most helpful in thinking about the relationship between science and religion is this idea of agency and mechanism. When I was a senior in high school, the seniors, because we were extra awesome, got to sit in this different courtyard from all the freshmen, but then we had to take our trays back a longer distance to the cafeteria. So I made a bet with my friend Lisa. I said, hey, Lisa, I'll flip a quarter. Every day that it's heads, you take both of our trays back. And every day that it's tails, I'll take both of our trays back. She said, great, 50-50 sounds good. What would you say if I told you that I flipped heads 20 days in a row? 4 weeks of heads. There's murmuring. Statistically, it's like a 0.00095% chance of that happening. It's way out there. Some people murmured he had a fake quarter. And I did. I had one that had the face machined off of it and inlaid in the back of another one. It was the right weight and everything. And it was awesome until it doesn't really say much for the content of my character or their cleverness. But people really started to watch and see, hey, Rittenhouse has flipped heads 15 days in a row. You should look up and see what the world record is, something around there. But anyways, in that event, I was an agent. I was orchestrating and plotting and planning and coming up with a big purpose that I wanted to work out for my own end. And the quarter was the mechanism by which I brought my will into being. So there's a why that's in the mind of the agent, and there is a how that is part of the mechanism. So it's a who and a how are the typical questions that we have whenever we start asking the question of why. In order to get a why, we ask who and how. And so there's an agent, who is the one doing it, and a mechanism, how is it that they're doing it? And basically speaking, that's the way that science and religion cooperate and overlap, is that science gives us an incredible description of the way that the world works. It is the master of the how. How does this work? And we delve into it, we roll up our sleeves, and we delight, and we experiment, and we figure it out. But that doesn't necessarily negate the category of the who or the why. Why are we doing this in the first place? What's the big question? Now, some of you will remember from Greek mythology the story of Procrustes. Did anybody remember Procrustes? If you think just because this is Greek mythology that somebody's going to die in this story, you're absolutely right. So the way this works is that Procrustes was an innkeeper, and he had a metal bed, let's say it was 6 feet long, and everybody who came and spent the night in his inn, he forced them to fit into that bed. So if you showed up and you were 6'6", he chopped 6 inches off of you and fit you into his bed. And if you showed up and you were 5'6", he put you on a rack and stretched you and made everybody fit into that bed. That's called a Procrustean bed. It's when you have a predetermined set of limits and you say, this is where everything has to fit, and then force everything into it. Now, like all good Greek mythology, somebody comes along, forces Procrustes into his own bed, and he dies, and the world goes on happily ever after. But in philosophy of religion and philosophy of science, we talk about these terms of a Procrustean bed, saying we've predetermined a set of boundaries and have said everything has to fit within this. Now, on the conversation of faith and science, everybody in the past has been guilty on some measure of this, of saying everything has to fit in the bed of religion. It's all, the Bible explains everything about everything, and it all fits right here within that bed. And the Bible itself doesn't even make that point, so that's out. But then there are other people who said everything has to fit within a naturalistic framework. Only scientific materialism gives us the accurate description of reality. It all has to fit within that. And I would just challenge you not to contradict either of those ways of thinking, but to push you to think is, what are the limits and the parameters that I've presumed to be in place that might limit my thinking in this? And so if we take the idea of an agent and a mechanism and restrict it just to a strict scientism or naturalism, it effectively eliminates the who and the why, and everything becomes a how. The trouble is that when you replace a who with a how, the why gets weird. You end up with how and how equals why, not who and how equals why. And so you need the who's and the whys in order to give a foundation for ethics and meaning around our structured introduction and the ways we think about science. And so in that sense, This stood out to me for the first time. I was speaking to a group of students at MIT on the meaning of life, and one of the students raised his hand. He said, "I don't understand why you would even ask why questions," which is kind of funny, yeah, why you would ask why. And I said, well, you can help me out. And everybody giggled a little bit, but then I said, no, wait, don't laugh. This is very serious. Think about the way that you view the world. It is what it is. It's complete naturalism. Asking why actually doesn't make sense. You're absolutely consistent in the question that you're asking. There isn't a reason to think outside the Procrustean bed of naturalism to ask, could there be a who that's behind this, or is there a broader why or purpose behind this? And so that's what I'm saying. Is there room, not in categories that contradict each other, but that expand and think more fully about the ways that we describe reality? A former professor of mine, John Lennox, often said it this way. He said, imagine you walk into my house and there's a pot of water that's boiling and you say, why is there water boiling? And you can go through, well, because the electricity flows through the coil, creates resistance, which has a thermal reaction with the bottom of the pot, and there's a pressure differential and it bubbles and the water is boiling that way. And that would be a great description, right, of why the water is boiling. Or you could say, Professor Lennox, why is the water boiling? And he could say, because I want a cup of tea. And so both of those are full descriptions of, one is a scientific description of the how, the process, and one of those is a description of the why, the purpose. And so scientifically speaking, we study the hows and the process, the things that we transcend. We hope that we have more complicated minds than some of the inanimate materials that we work with. So science, the things that we transcend, the hows and the processes, but then religiously and philosophically, we're thinking about the possibility of things that transcend us, the whys and the purpose. So one's a how and a process, and the other is a why and a purpose. It gives us a big picture, not in order to restrict our field of vision and to make us think about less, but to know the bigger context in which something is articulated, to know and to enjoy deeper. Now, one of the big ways in which we get, this whole thing doesn't seem to make sense, is the idea of miracles. Well, what is a miracle anyway? I mean, that seems like a complete violation of nature, so it has to be a gimmick. We know that we have these mathematical models that give us great regularity and predictability about what will happen next in nature. And I was once talking to a man named Owen Gingrich. He's an emeritus astronomer for the Smithsonian, also an emeritus professor of physics and the history of science at Harvard. And he said, actually, this isn't that difficult. If you come to a place where you believe that there is a God that is transcendent over this, that actually put all of this into motion, it's not a difficult presupposition within the internal consistency of the way of thinking to say that this God can intervene and interact momentarily. Not that he changes the models and the laws there, but does unique things within it from time to time. It's not internally inconsistent in the way that we think about the world. But what you do have to have for that is the concept of the who being transcendent and distinct from the hows. God has to be separate from and apart from. And this is one of the categories where a Canadian Catholic philosopher like Charles Taylor will say, Christianity's contribution to the scientific inquiry and the scientific mind came from the fact that Christianity took the fairies out of the trees. And what he meant by that is that in an animistic framework, we shouldn't expect regularity in the natural world. But once we recognize that anything that is divine is independent of the material that we see, that supersedes and transcends and looks over that, then we can expect great regularity and consistency within the natural world. There's repetition to the point that we can even talk about approximating things as models, or as we used to call them, natural laws. And so you need a separation to make sure that these things stay in their proper, distinct categories in order for this to work. Now, if it is true that there is a who, and we can know the who and study the how, and therefore get a picture of the why, and that gives us a foundation not just for what we research, but also some ethics about what is the purpose behind this and what is a violation and what takes this too far, then certain things begin to happen. If this is true. I'm not trying to prove anything, but I'm saying if it is true that there is a God who is a who, and that we have a world that we can model and investigate and see the hows behind it, then it would also give us a framework for saying, actually, there are ethics that are necessary within science that science itself doesn't necessarily speak to, in the categories of our integrity as far as our funding and our reporting of our research and the way that we treat our fellow scientists. Those types of things. We need that for an ethical structure in our reporting and in our research. We also shouldn't be surprised then if it does appear that there are very distinctive things that make it look like something was behind setting us up, so to speak, in the sense that it looks like the universe is kind of tuned for folks like you with large brains and opposable thumbs to be here and to exist. That shouldn't surprise us. It shouldn't surprise us to find that we have creative minds that delight in exploring and in discovering and to seeking new things, and we kind of have this eager anticipation. We watch the sunrise because we don't know next what we'll figure out, and we'll delight in doing so. And it shouldn't surprise us, therefore, that we have minds that are made to worship, that when we look at the things that we can see, that they point beyond themselves to that which is unseen. Now, you may be sitting there and thinking, well, okay, that's cute, but let's be honest. Is it really necessary? And there's a new book every year and a half that's published by somebody saying, actually, we don't need this open system. Think about our world. Is there information that can come into it from the outside, or is everything that we have already within it? And so a lot of your new atheists, the Dennett's and Dawkins and stuff, are saying, no, it's a closed system. Strict materialism can explain all of this in every category. We don't need these crazy extra theories about cosmological teddy bears that make us sleep well at night. We don't need to make that kind of stuff up. We don't need to go there. And so the argument is like this. It's something called Occam's razor. And Occam was a philosopher who basically said, don't needlessly multiply entities. In short, go with the simplest solution. You don't have to come up with these crazy theories if there's a simpler explanation. And for me, in the way that I've been viewing the world and that I've studied and thought into, is that I think a Christian view of a transcendent God that can become immanent and work within the world, within the how, actually is the simplest explanation for reality. And it's because the questions that I have transcend just naturalistic questions. Strict naturalism does not bother me because of the questions or the answers that it gives to my questions. It bothers me because of the categories that it denies me the possibility of asking questions in. Oftentimes we see Christianity as the narrow-minded part, or the short view that is the enemy of fun and freedom. But actually what I'm saying is that I think maybe a Christian and a scientific perspective says actually there are broader categories of beauty and justice and an innate spiritual longing that we have, or the desire for a relationship with something that transcends ourselves, or with genuine other beings for reasons that are more than just materialistically altruistic. And so I at least want to be able to ask those questions and play in those categories. So let me taunt you a little bit into outside of the boundaries of the Procrustean bed of strict naturalism to think about what life might look like as we delve into those fields and ask big questions. Somebody once said it's sometimes these relationships and conversations get into situations that are analogous of, say you leave here this evening and you're walking back to the parking garage and you see somebody under a street lamp looking on the street. And they're looking all over the place, and it's pretty clear to you that they lost something, so you go up and you say, hey, what happened? They said, oh, I dropped my car keys. You say, can I help? They say, sure. And so you look for a little while, and you say, are you sure you dropped your keys here? And they say, oh, no, not really. I dropped them back there in the dark. And you say, well, why are you looking for them here? And they say, well, because this is where the street light is shining. And it's funny and sad all at the same time, because there are categories of life where we're searching for an answer, but we feel like the light is only being shown on this part of the sidewalk, and thus we're excluded from exploring into some of these other realms of darkness. Let's not overly narrow ourselves in the category of where true things can come from. Dr. Polkinghorne, who's a physicist at Cambridge, a theoretical physicist, and also an Anglican priest, wrote an interesting little book called A Belief in God in the Age of Science. There's also a PDF of a short article you may enjoy looking at. But one of the arguments that he makes in that article and in that book is that it seems like science doesn't give us a resting place. And that's good when we're trying to figure out the hows of life. There's always this eager anticipation, and there's this fun between, I don't know how it works in other fields, but in physics at least, it's we model theoretically what should happen, then we talk to the experimental guys, and they give it a try, and they're like, it's not exactly what we thought would happen. It comes back to the theoretical guys, and they try to come. There's this conversation, but none of us would say there's absolute truth in that. And we would say that the beauty that we see points beyond itself. It isn't an end in and just itself. It points to something further. It points to something more. And that a truly scientific approach to thinking about this should point beyond itself into the unknown. Now, part of the reason I think that there is a seeming conflict in our culture between faith and science, or science and religion, is because oftentimes some kind of quasi-religious answer is far easier to give than taking the time to do the intellectual work to come up with an actual answer to the question. I was standing on the sidewalk once, and a little boy asked his mom, Mommy, why is the sky blue? And what did she say? because God made it blue. And I was thinking, well, it has something to do with the index of refraction in the atmosphere and Fahrenheit's law and Snell's principle, and yeah, that's easier. You see what I'm saying? So, but then the question, why is there anything instead of nothing? Well, okay, that gets more into an interesting category. But both of those aren't necessarily antithetical, but we take these shortcuts into proposing ideas that we just throw out there and say, oh, we don't know the answer to it, so we're going to pose God in that question. And this is a critique of Christianity specifically, or even broader religious thinking of saying, you only posit a God, you believe in the God of the gaps. Think about all the things that we didn't know. We used to believe in Thor and all kinds of other stuff. Of course, Marvel might be right. We used to believe in all these other things, and as science answers these questions, we no longer need to postulate God in these gaps of these unknowns. We know why the sky is blue. We don't need to say God did it as a shortcut out of it. And that's called the God of the gaps. I want to submit to you that I've never believed in the God of the gaps. I've always believed in a God of the given. It's not because of what I don't know about the universe that I postulate there's a God. It's because of what I do know about the nature of the universe that I postulate there's a God. And so the further we push into and the further we explore and the deeper we go into and the further we recognize the complexity and we see the beauty of the way that what happens in our mind that we can mathematically model actually corresponds to reality in categories that we can't even naturally see with our eyes, it gets amazing to think of the complexity of the world and the beauty of it and the way that it's orchestrated together, and it points beyond itself to something even more majestic. And so the God of the given is a God worth worshiping. The God of the gaps rightfully can move aside on the stage. What I realized as a physics student was that even though we're great at modeling reality, none of us would ever say this is absolutely true. And the same thing is true in philosophical discussions. We are really good at answering hypothetical questions that we made up, but our philosophical ideas don't always neatly map onto reality. So we don't say this is true also. We say here are sociological and philosophical ways to map reality, and here are mathematical ways to map reality, but none of us would say those are actually true. And so I end up standing on the sidewalk watching students go by at my college thinking, what is it that the human heart is really longing for? What are we really after? And all of you are here, have finished middle school, and so you'll know that relationship is a big thing that we're after. And we keep investing in relationships that ultimately let us down, and it's kind of like a fly into the window kind of thing. We keep banging ourselves and trying to reach a light that we just can't get to. And I started thinking it's almost like we were created with the capacity to be in relationship with something that was permanent, that wouldn't let us down. And suddenly I started having this confluence of ideas of what if it is true that I have a large amount of gray matter and opposable thumbs to the light in discovering the world, and that I can have a wonderful time exploring the how processes of the world. But does that in any way negate my possibilities of relating to something bigger than that, to thinking outside the box, so to speak, and to pushing into the concept of the possibility of there being a God who made me this way because he loves me and wants me to be in relationship with him? Many of you may say, Nathan, it sounds like you want to have your cake and eat it too. And I would submit to you that's not true. I want more than that. I want to have my cake, and I want to eat it, and I want to know the baker. It goes beyond just having the cake. I want to have my cake and know the baker. And I believe that that is a model that is appropriate, both in the fact that it keeps the agents and the mechanisms in their proper categories. There's mutually benefiting overlap there, but it says that I can use my creative mind to explore the world in a way that doesn't necessarily cut me off from the category of thinking that there's a who behind my cake or dough ice cream or whatever it is we're about to have here in a minute. The challenge is that we live in a situation where it's hard to get good resources. We have a lot of news information. Some of it we trust more than others. It takes a while to develop anything that's worth believing in. And so there's a real need for us to have some view of the character and the nature of the person who's doing the revealing in any situation. And this became clear to me during my senior year. I had a philosophy of religion exam right after a physics exam, and I was studying with a friend of mine named Julia, and we were looking at our philosophy of religion notes, and I had two words in their definitions backwards from the way that she had written them down, and these were words that the professor had made up, and so there was no way we could Google it and figure it out. And I had this other exam. She said, I'll go and talk to him and see if I can sort it out in the morning while you're in your other exam. And in my arrogance, I said, that sounds great, but I'm going to assume that I'm right unless I hear otherwise from you. So the physics exam went over the next morning. I ran across campus, ran into the exam. The professor was handing out the papers. And right before he got to my friend Julia, she looked up at me wide-eyed and said, "Nathan, I talked to him this morning and you're wrong." And I went and sat down, flipped over the exam, 2 essay questions, 20% of the grade. First question, explain that term. Now, I had some serious thinking to do here because Julia could have really messed me over in that class. 50% of 20% of your grade, and so the question I had to ask myself is, can I trust the character and the nature of the person who's revealing truth to me? And I decided that based off of our friendship, I could, and she was telling me the truth, and the grade reflected that. Whew, thank goodness. But you see the challenge. We live in a world where it's difficult to trust somebody enough that when they tell us something true, we actually believe it. And so the character and the nature of the person who's doing the revealing becomes paramount for whether or not I believe that it's true. And so when I look at somebody or historical figures, the person of Jesus really stands out to me as somebody who proclaimed truth not for his own sake, that he could manipulate us into great economic models that would benefit him, but somebody who was really interested in truth for our sake, for the sake of the people that he was pointing to. Now, Christianity isn't without its scars when it comes to science and religion in the background. In 1967, there's a guy named Lynn White who wrote a now fairly famous article that basically, it's called The History of Our Ecological Crisis, and said everything that's wrong with the world, ecologically speaking, is the fault of Christianity and this worldview. What's interesting is he didn't say it was because of context that Christians have misinterpreted or applied in demeaning ways to our planet. He said actually it's because of the structured way that Christianity allows us to scientifically make conclusions and deductions and have a mechanical view of reality that fosters this type of scientism that leads into more of a mining mentality rather than a care for creation. And so throughout history, we could give a lot of examples of people who have pointed to the fact that the question, does science need religion, is a little bit silly because science isn't an agent that could need something. As a systematic way of thinking, yes, it needs some philosophical and moral support systems to it, but science itself, people often say, well, science says. Well, science isn't an agent that can say anything. Scientists can say things that are very helpful, and I'm very thankful for them. That's why I have my face put back on. My brothers tell me that if this is a $120,000 face, I should demand a refund. But that's what brothers are for. Let's speed to the end here. Science doesn't need religion. Scientists might. Just because you're brilliant at differential equations, advanced calculus, structural engineering, biochemistry, doesn't mean that you aren't human and that you don't have longings for justice, that you don't sense that there's a beauty that transcends materialism, that you don't feel like there might be spiritual things that transcend us, or that there's a capacity for a relationship that's deeper than what you've known. Being really smart and analytical and really gifted at filling in bubbles on standardized tests that allow you to get to a university like Rice, those are wonderful gifts, but it doesn't make you the master of knowledgeology in all categories. There's still more for you to learn after you finish here. And I hope that you, in your scientific pursuits, have caught a glimpse of the fun of what it is to learn. But I'm saying, and just taunting, science doesn't need religion, scientists might. And the other question is, then do you need religion? And you're thinking, oh no, here it goes. Nope, I'm not going to preach to you, but I am going to taunt you. And I'm going to challenge you to think beyond the categories of strict materialism and say, is it possible that there's something more that's out there? Is there really beauty and justice and spirituality and relationship and depth and meaning and actual purpose to my life that transcends what I can physically get my hands around? We're going to turn it over to you guys here in just a second to your table leader, the important people there, have the instructions of what's going to happen next. But let me just say this before I sit down and turn it to you. Since we're going to have ice cream, let's put it this way. In my mind, a world of all science and no religion is just like a world of all ice cream cones and no ice cream. Ice cream doesn't threaten the existence of the cone. In fact, it fills it with a meaning and a purpose. And on the other hand, the cone doesn't threaten the existence of the ice cream. In fact, religious experience that isn't undergirded by structured objectivity is a complete mess and a disaster. We see that in the news all over the place. And so I, like many children, enjoy my ice cream and my cone. And as a Christian, I enjoy my relationship with my Creator, and I delight in exploring the creation that He has put me in. Thank you for your kind ear. Enjoy discussing, and we'll be back in 15 minutes for some conversations.
He's exactly right. I just want to give a little asterisk to that. This is the time to ask the questions and to kind of poke and prod a little bit. This isn't maybe the time to give all the answers that you have pent up inside of you. Because we have about 15 minutes, and if you don't want to say anything at your table, you don't have to. If you have to duck out, feel free. But I do want you to just, for 15 minutes, talk about the 2 questions that your table leaders have, and maybe try to pick which are some of the best ones, and then we'll do 15 minutes of Q&A. So you've only got about 25 more minutes to go, and then we'll have DoCone. They are setting up right now, and I'm excited for that. So go ahead and go to your discussion, and I'll get you in about 10 minutes. All right. I kept my commitment. That was exactly 14 minutes and 33 seconds, 34. And you can stop acting like you want to talk to each other now, and you can give now your attention. I would like table leaders or someone articulate at your table that is able to enunciate. Would love for you guys to now do question and answers as Nathan finishes that really solid point he's making over there. Or I can take a whack at a question. But yeah, we'd love to. Any table leader want to ask the first question of our Q&A time for the next 15 minutes, and then we'll transition to DoCones. Do we have any volunteers?
Yeah, the first question is always the hardest. So let's start with the second. Yes, right here. And if you want to give your name, if you're so bold. We affirm you.
Our table just wanted to ask, we know how you were discussing how rationale isn't the only thing that that's a factor in human decision making.
Yeah.
So what other factors other than logical reasoning or rationale go into human decision making, and why do we rely on those other factors when the outcome might be for or against us? Like, why do we make decisions even when they're bad for us?
Yeah, wow. Wow, yeah, a lot of questions in there, really good ones. And really, it's a scientific field of moral psychology also is a big part of that, of analyzing the preconceived notions that we have and things that make us decide. And so what I want to say is just a leaving thought, and a gentleman and I were just having a conversation about this, and here's a different example of it. When we talk about the relationship between rationality and emotion, I think we want both of those, but it's very important for our rationality to precede our emotion. True things can have wonderfully emotional benefits to them. Truth based off of emotion is a disaster. And the example of this that I'll give you quickly, and this is not a romantic thing to do, but it worked in my case, is when I asked my wife to marry me, I said, hey, look, I don't know fully what it means to say that I love you. I'm assuming that people that have been married like 60 years know a lot more about love. I think I know that, but let's be realistic, I don't. And so there was my skepticism of my emotional experience, right? Of saying, I think I know what it means to say I love you, but let's give it 60 years and figure that out. No. So what I said is, I don't know what it, and everybody's like, she should have smacked you. But what I'm saying is that I said, I don't know fully what it means to say that I love you, but I do know enough about the content of your character that I'm willing to be committed to you for life and to grow in the fullness of what love means. And so any type of emotion that we experience in our marriage is a derivative of the commitment. And it's a wonderful thing, and it's beautiful because it's safe. Even when the emotion isn't there, we're still committed to each other because of a commitment about the characteristics that we knew of each other. And so that would be an example that I would give of, don't marry somebody because you think you feel like you love them at that time and then hope to form a commitment based off that. Have it go the other way around. And if there is a God who really loves you and gave you a logical, structured thinking mind, again, it shouldn't be ridiculous to us to think that there would be logical reasons for believing that there is a God, and then lean into that and say, based off of this commitment, it's safe to grow in the direction of these emotions, not the other way around. So we want to have both of those together, because the fullness of what it means to be human is to laugh and cry and weep and mourn and rejoice and dance and sing, and a lot of things that don't make sense. My favorite is, somebody's like, why did so-and-so do this? And they're like, oh, he was in love. as if that's a good reason for something, right? But our culture accepts that as, and so work within that balance of saying we have to have both of these, but they have to be in the proper order. And so that's why in the beginning was the Word, according to Scripture, was the logic, the divine reason, the rationality, and God reveals himself in his character and nature to us, and then we grow in loving response to who he is based off of a commitment that is a full body commitment, very much including our minds. So thank you for the good question.
We got a follow-up to that.
Okay.
So, after hearing that, basically, what good is evidence then?
Yep. So yes, I will. So the question was, well, what good is evidence then? And this is actually a far trickier question than you would, I mean, I'm sure you get the full complexity of it, is because in order to make a decision, we almost have to preemptively decide what counts as evidence for us. And there were a number of students at MIT that I spent a lot of time with, and they were kind of in the category of not really being sure whether or not they existed. And it's a serious question for some people, the problem of minds. But I kept asking them, well, what would, other than the fact that this reality pays cash, what would count as evidence? And they would keep checking off like, well, if I had, a dream, I could say that's a neurological. If I had an hallucination, I could be, dehydrated, and keep pushing. And so the question really isn't just even in scientific categories, what good is evidence? It's in any category of decision making, what good is evidence? And we have to recognize that there's a threshold of knowledge that we have to have in any category to make good decisions that we can't have 100% certainty about. But our minds are created to make these decisions. When I walk across the street and I see the bus coming, I make a decision. Yeah, I can beat it, or no, I can't. And I don't have 100% certainty on there, but I have enough information to make it that it's a plausible decision to step in that direction. And so maybe we could say that there aren't slam dunk proofs and there isn't slam dunk evidence, but we can say that there's enough evidence for us to move to a new vantage point. I can't see what's on the other side of the mountain, but it makes sense for me to climb to the top of the one that's in front of me in order to be able to continue to see. And so I think what I would challenge and encourage you guys to do is to think about what are the things that I need to know in order to make a valid decision about anything, and then not put that into a separate category for faith and science, whereas if we have to I'm a Christian, now I unhinge my brain and punt it. But to see that there's continuity in the way we use our minds in all of those categories. But for a lot of us, that will come down to individual decisions about what counts as evidence. I think it's a wonderful privilege that we're creatures that are made to live in community, and that we can peer review and evaluate journals and ideas that people have and bounce them off and work together to shed light on these things. So I can't answer it specifically, but I would say take advantage of the communities that you're in as you discern these things and move forward. Great question. Yes. Hey, Franklin. Yep, okay, so the question was, what is your understanding of the spiritual realm and how do you reconcile that within the natural world? Okay, specifically angels and demons. Somebody once asked John Lennox if he believed in extraterrestrials, and he said, sure, I just call them angels. So the category, it goes back again to the Owen Gingrich statement of if you are willing to posit a transcendent God, then it is completely consistent within our worldview to say that there would be beings that are non-physical that are created. In fact, it's not unrational to say that we have elements of our own humanity that are non-physical, that we ourselves are spiritual beings in some sense. And so to say that there could be causative agents in the universe that are non-physical isn't a contradiction of a physical reality that we live in. It, again, is just a little bit more than what we're used to. So when Jesus shows up, he doesn't necessarily contradict at all, actually, the material world that we lived in. And remember, if we take the Bible seriously, God pronounced that the world, the physical world as we see it, is good. And so Jesus wasn't contradicting a scientific understanding of the world. He was just kind of peeling the lid on the clock back to show us the gears and say, what if there's a little bit more? And so I would put the angelic realm into that category of saying, certainly there are spiritual entities and realities that exist. The problem is it's difficult for us to believe in that because we don't have scientific equipment that can track that. I mean, it's hard to calculate the speed of a demon leaving or something. We just don't have good access for that. And a lot of these things are monkeyed with in ridiculous ways and taken non-seriously, or people do different goofy things with them to make us say like, we don't want to think about that. But here's I guess the real way to say that is if there are categories of reality that I have not yet seen, can I believe in something that exists in that category? And again, that comes back to the character and the nature of the person who's revealing and making truth claims about that category. And so if there are things that I can't see but other people have seen, can I trust that revelation? And again, it points to the character and nature of the person revealing that. And I would say that Jesus took all of those categories very seriously. And so even without a scientific understanding, historically, and based off of my confidence in who Christ is and his integrity in revealing reality, that I can have a platform for that, but it doesn't show up in the test tube or under the microscope. Good question. Yes, back here. Uh-huh. Great question. So the question was, going back to Occam's razor, how can we say that the Judeo-Christian version of that is the simplest answer compared to anything else, really? And so this is an absolutely crucial point. There are several arguments, pointers, we won't say slam dunk proofs, that point to the idea that it's rational to believe that there's a God, like the cosmological argument, anything that begins to exist has a cause, the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. Well, that just gets you back to some type of first cause thinking, well, it's possible to think in that category that there's something non-material that transcends matter. But that doesn't say, oh, Jesus died for my sins. No, it's just a first cause of some sort. But then what we can start doing is thinking more logically through that, of saying, okay, not only was there a first cause, but it seems to have created in such a way that it would be possible for me to develop in a way that I could think about what it is. So there's a relational category there. It seems, given the balance of things, there's a benevolence to this. So there are ways you can begin to think into that when Jesus shows up and begins thinking about, I see your hand, we'll come back around to you. When Jesus comes around and starts talking about reality and being the fullness of that, these things that I have questions or kind of ambiguous categories for, he names. And so there's a fit there. And so I would say we don't need Jesus just for creation in that argument, but then when I come into the categories of the balance between justice and mercy and the purpose of worship and concepts of beauty and of relationship, that's where the Judeo-Christian model starts to edge away, in the sense that it gives different categories of what the point of religion is. So for example, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me. And immediately you see, well, that is the weirdest thing anybody could potentially ever say, because he's saying that truth is non-neutral, that it has a point, and that the purpose of truth is relationship with an all-powerful heavenly being. And so nobody else is offering that as a category of saying truth is to put us in relationship with God. In fact, that's blasphemous in a lot of other systems. And so a very short answer to a very long and good question is that it's, what are all the data points that need to be assumed under one theory, and what one worldview best accounts for all the data points? So your neighbor has a pushback question. Great. The answer to what? Yeah. Probably in the categories you're speaking of. I mean, it's not like, what's gray and has a furry tail. It's a squirrel, but.
In this specific setting, are saying that the Judeo-Christian God created us, created everything, and that is the way to that.
So I'm saying that if that is true, that the world looks like we should expect it to work and function like we should. So yes. But the way to the afterlife is maybe a bit of an extension past where I was going, because I would say that relationship with God is a present reality and possibility too. So eternal life is that we may know God from now till when. No, I do believe that it's true, but I'm not trying to impose my worldview into your mind that you would have that as a presupposition to come to where I am. Yeah. Yeah, so the question is on the depth of the certainty of, like, am I 100% sure, definitively certain that it is the answer for me? And again, I'm going to go back and say nothing is provable except for mathematical proofs, but I think on the scale of several logical ways of thinking about the world, that it makes sense to believe that there's a God. And based off of that, just rational thinking, it's not improbable to assume to begin looking in those categories. And then I would put a lot of emphasis on the historical realities of what people have known and done in our world. Specifically, I would hinge a ton on the person of Jesus. And the Bible itself actually does that. It sets itself up as a falsifiable document. Paul, early thinker, said, hey, if Jesus didn't raise from the dead, the whole thing's a hoax. The game's off. The show's over. And so there are things of, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, Christianity is a hoax. And so there are things that we can look at in history and put our finger on and decide whether or not we believe that it's true based off outside evidence. So there's the logical, rational, metaphysical, there's the historical, but then the experiential can come from that as a validation of commitments to those things. Mm.
Mm-hmm. Stuff. And then you go by what history says and what Jesus said, but none of us heard that. The people who wrote it could have been lying.
Could have.
None of us know that Jesus actually existed. You could say, well, there's this document that says this. You could say, Joseph just wrote this, and this is actually a secular account. That doesn't mean it happened either.
Yeah, so, well, be careful there, though, because I can think of one academic historian that doesn't believe Jesus existed. That's a pretty slam dunk across the board, whether you're Hindu, Buddhist, whatever. Yeah. Yeah, so I'm just saying it comes back to this question of what counts as evidence and how far can we push into it. And I would say on the question of whether or not we exist, if you fall in love with somebody in the Matrix and then meet that person outside of the Matrix, what's the nature of your relationship? He said awkward. Yeah, and so it's a question of saying maybe you can't know with 100% truth, but can you know enough to continue looking and searching and being open? I actually don't know if my wife is alive right now, but I'm going to call her this evening. Does that make sense? Like, I don't have 100% certainty that she is, but I will attempt to contact her to see if she is, and that will validate. And it's not an irrational thing for me, because there's a difference between, and I think to make the distinction between what's possible and what's probable is a helpful way as we're thinking about evidence. We don't have 100% certainty in anything.
Well, I'm 100% certain it's 8:47.
Oh, okay. Hey, come talk to me.
So here's the beauty. Leslie Newbegin said, we don't have certainty, but do I have a proper confidence? And he is pushing the right buttons, and he's getting into textual criticism, which is very scientific, a way of looking at a text. And I think it's a wonderful stream of questions. If you have questions that weren't answered, I'm a really bad resource. He's still available.